Hello and welcome to Data Matters, the last in the current series of the Data Matters show, brought to you by Privacy Culture. Good afternoon, I'm Steve Wright, and I've got two wonderful guests here to talk about privacy and data ethics. This, sadly, as I said, is the last show of 2020. And to be perfectly honest, I'm kind of glad 2020 is coming to an end. It's been pretty horrendous. Anyway, we're here to talk about data ethics. Now, data ethics is sort of also, known as systemizing, defending and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct in relation to data. There are many principles surrounding this. There's excellent guidelines on the internet. Even if you just Google this, lots of different theories and different approaches about data ethics. But there are two or three principles which I'm just going to touch on before I introduce our wonderful guests today. The first principle is the minimizing the risk of harm. So very much, how do we do that in terms of data? The other is obtaining informed consent. Another sort of principle around this is around protecting anonymity and confidentiality. And of course, a really good guiding principle here is about avoiding deceptive practices. In a recent example, the ICO, the UK ICO, published its report on the UK's main political parties' use of citizen data. Political parties may legitimately hold personal data belonging to millions of us to help them campaign effectively. But the developments in the use of data analytics and social media by these political parties mean that many voters are unaware of how their data is being used. And so the ICO then went on to make some recommendations or some improvements for those political parties. All the political parties here in the UK were audited. And in fact, over 70% of them were classified as urgent or demanding higher priority fixing, relating to both the systems, the way the data is being used, the safeguards, and the important concept of accountability. So I think this is a really important kind of breakthrough here, because what we're talking about is it highlighting transparency, accountability, raising questions around profiling, marketing using social media, and obviously the correct lawful basis. Last week, if you recall, we looked at some of the facial recognition, and some of the ethical debates were coming up in that, and certainly the questions coming through from the audience were along the similar ilk. What should be considered? How should privacy should be considered? So to answer these questions and many more, and by all means, audience, please feel free to write with your questions. Unfortunately, we don't get a chance to read all the questions. Try to make sure that we only read the ones that are questions and not statements. And some of the stuff we can't talk about because these two wonderful guests represent two major organizations, and like you and I, they're limited in sometimes what they can and can't say. So let me first introduce Vivienne Artz. Vivienne is the world-renowned legal expert on data privacy and is currently the CPO for Refinitiv, and has held multiple roles. I'll just give us a wave, Vivienne.
Hi there.
Wonderful for you to, and also you recently won. I mean, I know that you do an awful lot from a charity perspective for diversity and all these wonderful causes as well. So I'm forever seeing you on LinkedIn with awards and recognitions. It's great.
Thank you.
It's really
that's
great.
Lovely.
And our other guest is Nathalie Laneret. Did I pronounce that?
Laneret.
Laneret. Apologies.
No problem.
No, my French is terrible.
You can say Laneret.
It's the English style.
Yeah, I know, but we always pronounce the T, right? And it's just not good. It's Laneret. Nathalie is the Director of Research for the Centre of International Policy Leadership. And I can honestly say CIPL is one of the world's best. I really do always read their outputs, and their research is amazing. Nathalie is widely recognised as a leader on data privacy matters. She's a lawyer herself, like Vivienne. And so it's, without further ado, I just want to welcome you here today, Nathalie.
Thank you, Steve.
Right. So without further ado, as normally we do, we try to answer your questions, but we have a few prepared questions ourselves. So whilst you're thinking about what it is you would like to ask these two fantastic experts, I'll start off the questions. So this first question really is to Vivienne. What is data ethics, and more importantly, why are they needed?
Oh, excellent question. Thank you so much, Steve, and a pleasure to be on your program today. Data ethics is basically morality, but it is, I think we think of data ethics as morality in the digital sphere. So I was listening to Ellis Parry, who's the data ethics advisor at the ICO, and he came up with quite a clever sounding definition, saying that data ethics is an emerging field of philosophy seeking to codify a way of assisting controllers to determine what is a right/wrong purpose or means of processing personal data. I think that's a fantastic definition, but for me, it's just really about distinguishing between right and wrong. Perhaps we are less comfortable with using the term morality these days. And I think the reason it's come to the fore and is so important is that data protection has now become a fundamental human right, and that then raises ethical issues, cultural issues, as the case may be. But specifically, the focus on ethics is due to the increase in the development of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that's where we're seeing this conjunction between ethics and AI. They kind of sit together. You can barely say the word ethics without also saying AI. And hopefully we'll have a chat a bit later in the discussion about, what that means. But ethics is us applying our moral lenses to what would otherwise be a practical business or even potentially a legal question. So it might make business sense, it might be legally permissive, but really, is it ethical? And so I think that's where I land in terms of ethics.
Wonderful, thank you, Vivienne. That was a brilliant description. And Ellis was he BP? Was it BP?
BP, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Amazing character. So yeah, it's great to hear that he's helping define some of that kind of thoughts and solidify what can be slightly nebulous, So Nathalie, then I suppose the next kind of natural question is to ask around, is there a legal mandate for this? We as Vivienne just alluded to, there's cultural issue here. There's the increasing use of automated decision making and algorithms that don't require humans necessarily, but could impact or affect us as data subjects. But what's, in your professional opinion, what's the legal mandate for this? Is does it say anywhere thou must have data ethics in the regulations anywhere, or what's your thoughts?
Thank you, Steve, for the question, and very happy to be here as well. And actually, to answer your question, I will go back a little bit in time, which is 30 years ago when I started law school, because my first essay was about what is the difference between law and ethics and moral principles. And we are tasked to write a dissertation on this. And actually, I think that's a very relevant question. And the answer to that, of course, is that unlike ethics as defined by Vivienne and moral principles, law is really enforceable by regulators, by courts, by judges, whereas morality itself is not. Unless, of course, those moral principles or those ethical principles become part of the law itself. And actually, when looking at this through the lens of privacy is very interesting because, as Vivienne says, due to machine learning and AI applications and development of new issues and questions under privacy law, we've actually digged through some old principles that have been in the law for a long time that are in GDPR, but were also in the 9546 directive, right, that are now being reinterpreted and leveraged in the world of AI and new technologies. And of course, I'm thinking far and foremost about the first principle of Article 5 of GDPR, which is the principle of fairness. To answer your question, is there a legal mandate? Well, if you look through this lens, yes, indeed, there is clearly a legal mandate as far as some of those technologies are concerned. But beyond a legal mandate, there is also somehow a reputational mandate, because we see that even though, from on the one side, law can be enforced and ethics, unless they are in the law, cannot be enforced, both actually may convey strong reputational consequences on companies. And I think this is really where they meet. So, I mean, maybe I'll comment a bit later. I'll leave this with you for now.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. And it's just so good to hear how, even 30 years ago, you were having these debates, and here you are, fast forward 30 years, and you're still thinking about that. And I doubt you still have copies to your old thesis, but it would be fascinating to be able to dig out and look at what we wrote 15, 20, 30 years ago compared to now, because some of those debates are still riding strong. So great example, Nathalie, thank you. Okay, so look, what we're alluding to is the process of identifying, and you touched on it there quite nicely about the other consideration of reputation. We're talking about risk, really. We're talking about privacy risks involved with the data collection or the data analytics, especially when it comes to things like biometric or sensitive personal data, such as some of the medical data that's being collected for very good purposes at the moment due to COVID research. I'm curious to know, how does this principle of sort of purpose limitation come into play? What especially given we're trying to, that's a principle that's applied across the world. I think there's over 132 countries now with some type of privacy law. What's the sort of is that still compatible, I suppose, is what I'm saying, with the the use of it and then the purpose of it? Is that where this conflict is coming in, and is that where the governance or the ethic question or the question of ethics starts to play? I mean, I'm happy to ask that to either of you. Vivienne, did you want to, or Nathalie? Okay, Nathalie.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I can take this one, and this is a very relevant question, because the law and our interpretation of those core principles really have to evolve together with technologies. They cannot just remain the same and be interpreted the way they were interpreted when those laws were first adopted, and the first ones were adopted back in the 1970s, right? Which looks like a very long time ago, right? I was not even born.
Yeah.
I was not even born, but
not that long ago.
but so taking the example specifically of as you mentioned, purpose limitation and purpose specification. I mean, we have to find ways to make this work, and regulators have a great responsibility in making this happening, but also working together with different stakeholders, including, of course, industry, but also civil society, to understand how we could make this work in practice, because we should not think only about the potential risks of those technologies, but also the enormous benefits that these technologies could bring, and that a too rigid interpretation of those core principles could run the risk of actually not enabling. So, another key element of GDPR is that you can also perform processing for a compatible purpose. So why not start thinking about whether algorithmic training should not be considered either as a compatible purpose or as a separate specific purpose, because also when you train an algorithm, actually the risks to individuals are quite low, because you're just doing some calculation to come up with possible inferences, and you're not actually really applying this to individuals to make decisions. So, we have to be creative, we have to be flexible, we have to be agile, and for sure we have to make this work. And the law, I think, and in particular GDPR, enables for this.
Yeah. Could I come in on that one, Steve? I think Nathalie's made some excellent points there, and I was just reflecting on purposes. And I was actually listening to Professor Ifomwa Ajunwa, who's at Cornell University, amongst others. She's actually publishing a book shortly. So I was moderating a session with the IAPP earlier this week, and she was focusing on what does it mean to be data driven. But when it comes to purposes, she was looking a lot at recruitment and how algorithms are used in recruitment. And I just wanted to share some interesting facts, which I think the audience might find useful. Apparently 9 out of 10 resumes in the US are now reviewed by an algorithm. So what we're talking about here in terms of the ethical piece isn't something that's theoretical, it's actually a live issue. And I'd love to get onto the question of what is the role of the DPO in terms of this, because I think we're not clear on that. And I wonder whether unnecessary burdens are being placed on the DPO in relation to the ethical element of it, which should or should not necessarily sit with them. But what's been interesting, I think, with the studies that she's been doing is actually looking at those algorithms that are used for hiring, the problems that have been experienced, some very high profile problems with some very big names where they found that their hiring algorithm actually discriminated against women. And the reason they found out that it discriminated against women is because they got all the CVs, but out popped, like 19 out of 20 of the candidates for interview were men. It was like, well, why is that the case? And then to Nathalie's point, it's because they fed the algorithm with the CVs of their executive team, 9 out of 10 of whom were male. And so it looked for similar characteristics in all of the applicants. And so it blew out their entire D&I policy and so on and so forth by creating this extremely skewed result. And I think that's there's a logical and a legal element to this, which is be careful of your algorithms and what you feed them, because at the end of the day, an algorithm, an AI, is there to exponentially increase the pace of processing, to apply a logic that we think is unbiased, but actually the algorithm reflects our biases. So again, it's going to magnify however you have programmed it. And if you've programmed it in a way that doesn't take into consideration unintended consequences, then it's going to give you unintended consequences. And so the key is to be very clear about all of that. And then they had, I think there was another one which was sort of algorithm which is doing a bit of data laundering, shall we say, but very interesting to see almost the ethical issues that arose from the algorithm, It's not ethical decision about whether or not you use whose CVs you use. That is a business, common sense, legal policy driven issue, but it yielded a consequence that left people wondering whether this was right or wrong. And so I think that's just a really interesting perspective on the purpose element of the discussion.
And sorry, to build on that then, I mean, as DPOs, well, this is what makes it incredibly hard, because how do we guide, how do we give our businesses that are asking us to get involved and to consider the implications of using these algorithms and huge benefits, as you've both alluded to, from spotting trends, especially with diagnostics and illnesses, etc., that we would otherwise be invisible to the eye. So there's huge benefits to be mentioned. But what do we do then as a DPO, Vivienne? I mean, what would be your thoughts when it comes to, giving advice around that? Yeah.
Yeah, so in the financial services sector, I think we're fairly familiar with ethics. So we're used to having things like ethics hotlines. Much of that was driven by legislation, Sarbanes-Oxley, whistleblowing hotlines, as the case may be, dealing with ethical issues where people want or feel that they need to report something that's not right. And there's the instinctive ethical moral piece. It's not right. It might not be illegal to arrange your business trips around significant sporting events, but is that really right, that you're using corporate funds to be traveling around the world and happening to fit in some business meetings so you could also attend all those significant sporting events? There's an ethical issue for you. Yes. So I think we're very familiar with that. I think ethics and data protection are now finding a place together, because many of the issues around processing personal data, particularly sensitive personal data, does give rise to those questions of balance. Is it right? Is it wrong? Where do you draw the line? Is it right that decision sits with the data protection officer? And I would suggest no. Okay. I think increasingly it is moving towards a data protection officer. And I think what we should be doing as data protection officers is instead pointing to what is now the voluminous guidance coming out of the UK, the EU, the US, international bodies, which are giving us checklists around ethics. And those are key terms around, is it fair? Is it transparent? Is it human-centered? And I think those are questions for the business to answer and perhaps to be guided by the data protection officer. But is it right that data protection officers are now answering ethical questions? I'm not sure that is the case, particularly if you're a DPO of a global organization. I think that part is really challenging. I'm just going to add one example, and then Nathalie, I know you've got a good comment to say. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know if anyone out there is a Trekkie, but I used to watch the Star Trek New Generation, and they had a counselor. And it was quite novel at the time it was in the 90s or something when we were watching that the counselor was there to answer the ethical questions as, the ship Discovery went through the universe, encountering extraordinary new peoples, planets, and scenarios. And the counselor was there, not as, well, first of all, there's a counselor, but really as an ethicist. Is it right? Yeah. And to ask the questions. She didn't make the decisions. She asked the questions. Nathalie, over to you.
That was great. Thank you. Nathalie, did you want to add to that?
I wanted to give simple perspective, because we've worked a lot on these topics, and we've actually mapped organizations' privacy program according to the simple will framework that we have developed for accountability purposes, and we've seen different schemes and different organizations, and especially in terms of where the DPO sits. And there are many possibilities, but generally the DPO sits within legal, or the DPO sits within ethics and compliance. And it's interesting actually that these cases are, we could say, as part of the organization that we surveyed, the most frequent organizations. And as far as I'm concerned, because I used to be a DPO before joining Sipol, I've always considered that somehow the DPO was a sort of ethicist in chief, but for the privacy issues, just because also that since data protection is really about doing risk assessments and assessing the impact of decisions of data activities on individuals, and trying to measure the potential severity, the likelihood, and making trade-offs, that somehow, even if you don't want to, and even if you don't realize, you're actually making some key decisions around these topics. And I think that the way forward, of course, for organizations that can afford it, is really to have a multi-stakeholder approach and have different people sit around the table and make collective decisions on this issue. So including, of course, the DPO, but also the general counsel, the data scientist, research and development, the head of ethics and compliance, the business, and so on and so forth.
Yes. Thank you both. I mean, and just listening to you there was the reason why I invited you both to this show, because I knew it would be insightful. We're now beginning to get some excellent questions. Keep them coming, please, audience. I shall filter the ones most appropriate. But before I come on to those questions, it's more on the question of, I just want to briefly touch on how do we manage this, because we're in organizations large and small. Sometimes small organizations, I mean, you've only got to look at the of the horrible cases that happen. Very small companies can have massive access and influence on data, as we found out a couple of years ago. So is there a kind of structure or oversight? What's your thoughts on that? I'm just curious to know, for our audience, what they should be thinking about in terms of what that might look like as a structure. So
I'll start on that, actually, okay. And because Nathalie, I think you've kind of given half the answer already, which is around the accountability structure. If I can do sort of a bit more of a rule of thumb, post the financial crisis, a lot of the financial firms looked at their culture, and I think culture will drive what your ethical behavior is. And there was a particular example which always stuck in my mind, which was when it comes to making a difficult decision, think of the 3 M's. What would my manager say? What would my mother say? And what would my maker say? And I thought, gosh, if you had a problem and you passed it through those 3 filters, I think you'd probably come up with the result that you need. If I think often people think of it in terms of, what is it going to look like to my customers, and what is it going to look like on the front page of the newspaper? You can choose whichever filter you feel is most appropriate, but I quite liked the 3 M's. The one to whom you're accountable for your job, your mother, because let's face it, you've got to look her in the eye and be honest. Exactly. And then nothing gets past God. So I thought those 3 were kind of cool. Okay,
Nathalie, do you want to add to that?
Yes, to add to the 3M, and be careful, Vivienne, because I used to work for a company that's called 3M, and they may sue you for IP infringement at some point. But anyway, no, I think also that just to say it in very simple, in a simple manner, is really about say what you do, but also do what you say, and if you have values you want to abide by, well, share those values, but then make sure that they are implemented effectively within the organization. Because if it's just wishful thinking or marketing slogan, and then nothing happens after this, then you're in big trouble. And I see we have only 10 minutes, so Steve, I'll just stop here.
No, that's wonderful. Listen, I knew this half an hour would shoot by, and always we are struggling with managing all of these huge questions that are coming through. So I think the question that came through earlier, I think actually, Vivienne, you've done a great job at answering this. How do you explain data ethics to your employees, your customers, and your service providers? Are there KPIs related to ethics that you think shoppers or service providers would consider? That part of the question, I suppose, we haven't really dealt with, but it's sort of alluding to there, Nathalie, as well, isn't it? When you're saying, you know, you are what you say you are. If you're going to do this, then do it. If you're going to be transparent with the data, then be transparent. And
I think trust is a very big part of that. And I think it's one of the things that is a big issue in data protection. And it's certainly one that the ICO has echoed, is that it is about trust. So it doesn't really matter what you say, it really matters what you do. And, you know, there's lots of online services where we never really read the terms and conditions, but the reason you keep going back is because you trust in the service and you trust that your data will be used fairly and that they're transparent about that, and that is a big driver. So, you know, the quick summary that Nathalie gave is absolutely spot on. You know, in terms of saying and doing the same thing, being consistent, and I think trust is the main driver there. And I have to say also that the accountability framework, CIPL came up with that first, and then the UK ICO has been consulting on an accountability framework which is very similar to the CIPL one. And I think going through that accountability framework helps you to focus on key areas of compliance and what that means and the impact. So the ICO again is very focused on the outcome, and many businesses understand that, and it's really about not so much rules and regulations, but what is the outcome as a result of whatever it is that you've put in place, and is it the right outcome? Does it feel right? Does it look right? Does it sound right? And you know, your ethical compass, your moral compass will help you decide whether or not that's the right outcome. And I think that's an easy one then for AI, isn't it? Which is the data going in you might think is okay, but you when you look at the outcome, you realize, nope, there's something wrong with this. It's either the data or the algo. Let's go and fix it because the outcome isn't what we wanted.
Brilliant. Nathalie?
Steve, I'm going to do something maybe that's a bit impolite, but do you mind if I answer a question that I think is interesting about whether ethics are universal and that, in contrast, data privacy principles are broadly similar? Because I think this is an excellent question, and I think that actually data privacy principles are not as similar as they seem. And the reason why I'm saying this is because as part of the work that CIPL has been doing on AI and trying to find ways to resolve those tensions between data privacy principles and artificial intelligence, we've actually gone a bit further into what fairness means. And we've looked at the translation of fairness into the 23 official languages of the EU. And you could not believe how many different definitions we came through. And I can give you a few of these. So depending on the country where you're in, fairness may mean good faith, honesty, goodness, equity, objectivity, justice, loyalty, trustworthiness, correctness, and there are some more. I mean, there are some more in our report. So the answer to the question is that no, it's not universal, and it's complicated because it's really culture. It really depends on the culture, and it evolves and it varies. So it really requires a very soft and agile approach to constantly making sure that you are aligned with what people expect. And the problem also in privacy is that it's very hard to know what is a reasonable expectation, what is a reasonable person. I don't know. Vivienne wants to add anything. Sorry, Steve, for just taking your role.
It's a great.
It's a perfect point, actually, Nathalie, and it's the one that I feel very strongly about, is that ethics has a cultural dimension. And therein lies the terrific challenge for global organizations when you have a global product or service or offering, or even a global workforce. What feels right, perhaps in the headquarters, isn't going to land in the same way in some of the further flung countries where you operate. And there is a different perspective, a different cultural norm around what's right and wrong, and a different legal norm as well. And that needs to be considered. So I think one of the challenges, for example, has been in relation to diversity and inclusion, taking a positive and proactive approach, asking people to share their diversity characteristics, etc., feels good and can be trusted in some jurisdictions, feels intrusive and is probably inconsistent with local laws in others. The objective is a positive one, but the impact and the how it lands isn't the same, and that gives rise to real challenges. So I think it's a really important point to make in terms of ethics, is that there isn't one single ethical norm or approach. We need to be very conscious of the fact that it means different things in different places, in the same way that data protection laws are different all over the world as well.
Thank you both, and that was a great question. Thank you, Graham, for that question. I've got a kind of combination. I'm going to hybrid some of the questions coming through from our audience. Thank you once again for these questions. This one is more kind of conscious of the time as well, so I'm sort of drawing to the practical aspects of our show, because we try to be as helpful as we can to the audience. So there's two questions here, but I think they're sort of asking the similar questions. So you decide to have a data ethics framework for your, say, recruitment AI. How do you go about practically building that data ethics framework? It is one thing to know about data ethics. It seems quite another to come up with some practical solutions, especially when larger organizations have not done so well at this. And then, so don't answer that. Recognizing that data ethics is more than just compliance. I think we can safely say that's been established today. Can the panel recommend any specific checklists or references, websites, etc., that are a good starting point for the DPOs? So I kind of feel that you know, there's one question there, and that's really where would either of you, if you were talking to a relatively you know, a DPO that's for the first time that's been asked perhaps to set up an ethical framework. Nathalie, do you want to have a go first at this?
Yeah, I can start by sharing just a few thoughts on this. I think that you know, in order to build your framework, you need first to really understand what is the organization's ambition. And I think it's very important to talk to not only the top management, but also employees more generally, to understand that what are the values of the organization based on which we want to build this ethical framework. So building the ambition, and then also measuring your maturity. Where are you? How far are you from this ambition? And how much do you need to close the gap? And is there a real a wish also from the leadership to support this journey, because it's a journey, right? We're talking about a framework, we're talking about building something. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It takes time, but I think that measuring ambition and the gap between the ambition and the current state is a key first step before thinking about building the framework by itself.
Wonderful. Vivienne, did you want to add to that, or are you anything you wanted?
Oh, yes, I did. So no, I completely agree with Nathalie in that. Isn't it interesting that every company has a vision or a mission statement or something similar, and so that is really where you start. on this journey is, who are you and where are you going and what is your purpose? And that will help set the tone for your culture and your ethical compass.
Yep. Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has come from Tim Rogers, and I'm conscious that we're nearly running out of time. But it's an interesting one. How do you how do you deal with researchers who are resistant to consider these issues if they consider it impacting adversely on, say, academic freedom or even innovation? That's a tricky one to get over. Any thoughts on that?
So it's an interesting one. Again, many organizations now have innovation labs, and that is where a lot of creativity takes place and free thinking, which is absolutely wonderful. But we still have to play by the rules. And it can be quite challenging addressing the requirements. It isn't a free-for-all. It isn't a blank piece of paper at all. And what's really interesting actually is to see the EU strategy developing in this area. They actually, through the Data Governance Act and others, are looking to create an EU safe environment with data sharing where research can take place in accordance with GDPR principles. So it's a GDPR compliant hothouse for innovation is where they're going. Other countries have adopted a slightly different approach. The thing with innovation and research is it isn't carte blanche. You do have to comply with basic rules, and they're just going to have to get with the program, with the mission, with the culture, with the vision, and there's always an ethical dimension to it, and they'll be superstars if they comply. Their projects are going to go nowhere if they don't.
Thank you, Vivienne. Nathalie, did you want to add?
Yes, I fully agree with Vivienne, and I really like this question because it really talks about freedom of innovation, but freedom of innovation is not the excuse to disregard other fundamental rights. And we need to remind some people, and I will not name anybody, that privacy rights, just like any other fundamental right, like freedom of innovation, freedom of expression, freedom of research, freedom to conduct a business, are not unlimited rights. They have to be balanced against other rights. And actually, we've done a bit of research on this, and as per the Human Charter of Fundamental Rights, all those rights have to be balanced against one another, except the right to life, of course, and the right to be free from torture. But outside of this, I mean, look, even our right to walk outside and our basic freedoms are being taken away from us now because those rights are not unlimited, and there are more compelling interests or reasons as defined by, our governments that justify some restrictions. And same for privacy and same for freedom of expression and innovation. That's what I would tell Tim Rogers.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Tim, for that question. That was a great one. Look, sadly, once again, time has flown by. I could spend all afternoon talking to you two. It's fantastic. I'm just going to summarise it by saying I love the 3 points that you both made during your individual comments. I love the 3 M's, what your mother would say, what your manager would say, and what your maker would say. I think that's great, Vivienne. And also I love, Nathalie, understand, when approaching this, understand the ambitions, understand the values, and understand the maturity. And I think both of those are 2 tools that can really help our audience today. So I, on behalf of Privacy Culture and DataMatters, want to thank you so much for giving up your Friday afternoon and coming on the show this week. It's been a real pleasure. Is there any kind of guiding thoughts or pearls of wisdom you want to give, or you want to say before we go and say goodbye to the end of this year? Vivienne, Nathalie?
I think there's been a lot of ethical questions this year for data privacy officers, and I hope you've navigated them as best you possibly can. And I suspect there's going to be more coming up in future, but this year has been a really big one for both privacy and ethics, and we're only going to see more of it going forward.
That's true.
And yeah, Steve, I will finish by 2 French sayings. First one is, do not try to be more royalist than the king. So don't ask artificial intelligence to do things that humans cannot do. And I forgot about the other one. I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
But I'll tell you next time.
Yes, exactly. And next time, I hope there will be a next time. Listen, this was absolutely wonderful. It's Vivienne Artz from Refinitiv, Chief Privacy Officer, and Nathalie there from the Centre of Information Policy Leadership in London, Brussels and Paris. And a big thanks for joining us, all the audience, for your questions. Are always good, and that's what we love. Hundreds of you dialing in this week. Once again, we thank you for all your time. We ask, please, that you give us your feedback, give us ideas of topics you wish for us to tackle next year in series 3, which Nathan, our producer, is now running out the door. As it's been really, really great fun running these Data Matters show, and we can only do that with your help and with your support, so we do thank you for that. So it's just down to me to say thanks once again, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we look forward to seeing you once again in January 2021. Thanks very much. Bye for now.